Session to order. My name is David Laibman. I'm the editor of Science and Society, which is a journal that's one of the co-sponsors of the session. Please check us out in the literature area. I'm also a longtime member of the Union for Radical Political Economics, which is the other sponsor, the other co-sponsor, so we're all together. And the session is Financial Parasitism, Understanding the Great Vampire Squids. Great Vampire Squids is a technical term which will be explained in the course of the session. So you'll be clear about that. I'm going to introduce everybody now so that we can then just go from one to the other. The speakers will present in the same order that they appear in the schedule. They are Julio Huato, who is an associate professor of economics at St. Francis College, and also a member of our Science and Society editorial board and manuscript collective and steering committee of IRPI. And a person of very widespread theoretical and historical interests. Michael Perlman, I don't have any books that I can point to, but he's written tons of them. He is from California State University, Chico, and he writes about a book a month. Well, maybe not quite. And he also manages to travel very widely. I see him in China.
I just followed you.
Yeah, he follows me. We were always managed to get together. And Michael Hudson from University of Missouri, Kansas City, and also from the Levy Institute up at Bard College. And here we have materials on display. Recent books, Financial Capitalism and Its Discontents, and The Bubble and Beyond, with a subtitle, Fictitious Capital, Debt Deflation, and Global Crisis. A prolific author and speaker. He's also, by the way, one of my favorite commentators on Russia Today, where I spot him from time to time. So these are our panelists, and we're going to set a generous 20-minute limit, but the timekeeping, which is my sole responsibility, is going to be strict. So I will let the speakers know when they're at the 15-minute point and then when the time is up. So we will begin with Julio Juan.
Okay, to keep myself contained in the 20-minute time period that I have, I'm going to read off the screen here. As I understand it, some authors, I think Michael among them, argue that modern capitalism has experienced a transformation whereby industrial capitalist production has become subordinated to or dominated by finance. And this goes contrary to Marx's expectations, Karl Marx's expectations, that as capitalism develops further, industrial capitalists would become the dominant group among the capitalists, whereas banking and finance would become merely subservient to the industrial capitalists. There are some authors like Jerry Epstein from Amherst, Tom Paley, and others who made similar claims. So finance is this bundle of largely unproductive, largely wasteful, if not outright criminal activities that consist of trafficking with promises of future payments, pieces of paper, PDF files, whatever, that entitle people to holders to future economic benefits. And that those activities may provide tangible benefits to some individuals, wealthy individuals, powerful individuals, privileged individuals, but at the expense of the greater macroeconomic fragility and risk for the rest of us. In this context, the notion of finance advance is that of pretty much fraudulent activities that violate not only the alleged norms of market competition, but also basic legal and ethical standards. And that when the increasing power of finance does not completely manage to reshape legislation to favor itself, and policy making, and even the ethical and aesthetic norms of society, that they are willing to cross the line between what is lawful and what is criminal. So finance capitalism is associated with swindle, fraud, white-collar criminal behavior. So I am not going to argue here that finance capitalism is not all of that. In one of the last pages of Volume 1 of Capital, Marx has a quote. Unfortunately, as I was typing this morning, I didn't have internet, so I couldn't go online and check exactly where the quote was and who the author of this quote is, but it must be some obscure English political economist that Marx digged out of oblivion. And he says something like this. This is what I remember. It's not a textual quote, but it says that capital eschews no profit. That if you give me something like 20%, I will be like bold. If you give me like 50%, I will be audacious. If you give me 100%, I'm ready to trample any human law. If you give me 300%, then there is no crime, heavenly or earthly, that I will not be willing to commit, even at the risk of being executed or, of course, enduring hell in the afterlife. So, amen, brother, right? But that applies not only to pushing papers and trafficking with promises of future payments, but it applies to any other activity, productive wealth or not productive wealth. And of course, the decision of what is wealth and what is not is ultimately something that has to be socially validated. It's people who decide what kind of things are helpful to them or useful to them as opposed to harmful to them. But so in my view, and this is something that I owe Marx a lot to, is this notion that there is no social order, there is no economic regime that can be entirely based on theft and fraud on the forceful appropriation of wealth. That the essential characteristic of capitalism is not exploitation, it's not the appropriation of someone else's wealth. That the essential characteristic of capitalism is the particular way in which exploitation is carried out. And indeed, that the normal form of exploitation under capitalism is accompanied by excesses, by abuses, and all those quote-unquote anomalies. And moreover, that those excesses and those abuses are magnified, they are turbocharged by the explosive power of energy that capitalism unleashes. So indeed, we expect to see a lot of abuses, a lot of fraud, a lot of that, but that is not the essential characteristic of capitalism. That the real problem of capitalism is not its excesses, but it's its normal modus operandi. It's the normal way in which it operates. So it's not the abuses, but the uses that are the problem. So the Marxist in me tells me that if finance has gotten so fat in modern times, it is because there is a lot of fatty food, there is a lot of carbo-laden food around, and that the food that feeds financial capital obviously has to be produced, has to be reproduced, anew continuously, recurrently, and that we shouldn't lose sight of that fact. So if the rentiers can live off the rents, dividends, capital gains, whatever, right, ill-gotten or, rightfully earned under the norms of the system, that if these rents are getting bigger, that means that is because somebody is producing the wealth that they are appropriating in those forms, in the form of rents, dividends, capital gains, etc. So if theft and fraud nowadays can fetch through, financial transactions, etc., it can now fetch these huge booties. It is because working people, are producing that much wealth. And that is something that when we focus a lot on finance, on monetary phenomena, then that tends to recede to the background, and instead of being exposed as part of kind of the hidden side, the hidden part of the iceberg. So wealth cannot be produced, cannot be reproduced by shuffling and reshuffling pieces of paper, PDF files, contracts, agreements among people, and that's what financial securities are ultimately all about. They are claims over wealth. And by shuffling them and reshuffling them, we are not multiplying wealth. What we are doing is simply redistributing those claims, and but wealth has to be produced the hard way, which requires, of course, the mobilization of physical resources, means of production, human bodies with, with brains. So the more formidable finance appears as a device to pump or extract and appropriate wealth by the few, the more we should infer that wealth is being produced, and is being produced dynamically. So, so I should clarify here that if we are in the business of exposing capitalism because we want it overthrown, and I think we are in that business, of course, then it is fair to denounce the abuses, the excesses, because those excesses are inherent to capitalism. They are phenomenic, but they are also essential because they reflect the essence of the system, which is, profit-making, the drive to appropriate surplus. So they are inherent to it. They are part of its modus operandi, but they are not the entire thing. So because we are not only in the business of denouncing, in the business of agitating, we are also in the business of understanding, because we have to replace capitalism with something better. And so that means that we have to be hard-nosed realistic about it. And so it is also important that we understand that ultimately, underneath the phenomenon of finance, there is capitalist production, right? Capitalist production. Because if we don't do this, I'm afraid that the populist message is the one that prevails. And the populist message that I get from these views is that if we could only remove these excesses, if we could only remove these abuses, then capitalist production would be healthy, and that would be for the for the well-being of everybody. If Main Street is left alone, right? If you remove those oppressive Wall Street bankers that are choking off Main Street, then everything would be hunky-dory. I strongly disagree with this view. In my view, finance is parasitic, but all capitalist activities, capitalist production, the production of the most noble, the most useful for the most healthy food, etc., is also parasitic in the sense that it's a profit-seeking activity. Thank you. All capital is parasitic, whether it is involved in productive activities or not, because the source of all property income, I'm using a term that is routinely utilized by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Feel free to, the Bureau of Economic Analysis splits national income into two great categories: labor income and property income. I think this terminology is pretty good. I like that, property income, so that means that your income doesn't come from your work. It comes from the fact that because of a social arrangement that we have that we call private ownership, right? It's a social arrangement, it's not a natural right, right? Because of that, you have rights over property. And because of that, you can extract, right, part of the output produced by the labor of those who work. So labor income versus property income is a pretty good classification, except that when they do the statistics, sometimes they mix up things. But so all property income ultimately comes from what Marx calls surplus value. And so on the surface, what we see is the income of different individuals. So if you have property, so you have income such as rent, such as dividends or profits, such as, if you are a top manager, you boss people around, then you get, some sort of corporate management compensation. If you are a plain worker or employee, you will receive a wage or a salary. In the surface, what we see is these things, but where actually is in dispute is the wealth, right, that is produced, for example, in a given year, right? So all of this income is nothing but the phenomenic form in which this product that is produced in a given year is claimed by individuals. So this is the problem of distribution. But underneath that, even underneath the the dispute over how the product is distributed among the newly produced product is distributed among the social classes, ultimately, and this is I think an insight of Marx, what we have is a dispute over the, well, Marx wouldn't use these mystical terms, but it's a dispute over the human soul. It's how the spirit of humanity, which is purposeful activity, what Marx called labor, right? It's a dispute over our conscious or focus time, right? I think nowadays we understand pretty keenly how the ultimate resource that we have in life is the mindful time, is our time when we are actually aware, deliberate, willful, right? And we carry out our life in a purposeful manner. So it is the dispute over that. It is the dispute over labor, right? Which is measured in time units, right? The dispute over a given day. How much of my time is going to be devoted to my own enrichment, the enrichment of my personality, the enjoyment of life for its own sake, or to what extent that's going to be hijacked from me, taken away from me, turned into an alien power that is going to oppress me, property, capital, something that is going to allow the holder of that to extract, to actually take that part of me, that part of my spirit, that part of my lifetime, right, and enjoy it for their own private benefit and at my expense. That, in my view, that is really the essence of capital. So, but regarding this issue of financialization, actually, although I assume, and I think it was right that I did so, I assumed that I wasn't going to have technology to project. So I was going to, I looked data and all that, but I didn't bring any charts or any handouts. But I'm going to make a few remarks that are a little bit narrower, and they are about how to understand the expansion of finance or financial activities as they are conventionally measured, say by the Bureau of Economic Analysis and other statistical agencies, right? How, thank you, how the growth of finance at the expense of other areas of the economy, how to understand it. All individual capitals, right? All individual capitals have to carry out certain activities that have to do with the handling of money, right? You have to be engaged with funding, right? Or whatever activity you carry out, if you are a capitalist, right? You're going to have to deal with money, with liquid funds, with liquid securities, whatever. And so Marx in Capital says something that also resonates with me in my understanding of finance. Marx says, the development of modern banking, right, actually is in part at least explained by the fact that some of these activities that had to be carried out individually by individual capitalists, right, in the early stages of capitalist development, individual capitalists have to handle all of these activities, right? They had to be involved with granting credit to their customers, etc., or with managing their funds, etc. All of those activities are being centralized, right, by large banks. And these large banks are actually reducing the amount of waste, the amount of unproductive activities that individual capitals otherwise would have to carry out. Right? You may say that this is kind of similar to some of the arguments that justify, made by conventional economists that justify the expansion of finance. And you would be right, because in that sense you can see a little bit of a coincidence. Even though Marx was radically critical of capitalism, he also understood that, with the large, that large banks were capable of exploiting economies of scale. And this way, right, it was possible for individual capitals to farm out some of these activities. Just like John Jay has to manage its facilities, plumbing, electric system, etc., right? And individual capitals have to also manage their money, manage their funds, manage their portfolios. However, it is possible to transfer those activities to large banks. And large banks, of course, these are large capitalist enterprises. but they are going to do it for profit. And then to the extent that you take a process, right, it's a unit, it's a single whole, and you take a part of it and then you stretch it, then there's a possibility that by fracturing this unity into parts, that some of the parts are going to stretch too far, and to the point that the only way in which this unit may have to be reestablished is going to be in a very violent fashion, right, through a crisis, right? So by the fact that you can take these activities that otherwise would have to be carried out by individual capitals and that now are carried out by specialized, organizations, large banks, it is possible that you're going to have more turbulence, more instability. So I'm saying that there are two sides to that. On the one side, right, under normal times, and this would be the emphasis on the normal times, right, there is saving of wasteful activities for individual capitals. But this at the expense, of course, the greater turbulence, because now these large organizations are going to run with it. The other thing that I want to mention is that capital is a global system. So just because we see finance in New York or London or Frankfurt or Zurich to expand greatly, right, that doesn't mean that we have to correlate that only with industrial activity in those countries, right? The phenomenon of financialization coincided, I'm just wrapping this up, coincided with also with a tremendous expansion in capitalist production, capitalist, parasitic, right, exploitative production in China, in India, in other parts of the world, massive. So that means that, it's not only, the industrialized experience of the United States that has to be connected with financialization in the United States, but we also have to take into consideration the fact that finance in the United States may have been also responsible for, enabling the capitalist production expansion in China, etc. And I'll stop there because my time is up.
Michael Perlman.
How can I follow that? I mean, banking, there are two concepts in Marx that I think are very useful in thinking about finance. One is a short remark that he made in the Grundrisse: all economics is the economics of time. Marx was in a sense following up Benjamin Franklin, who humorously solved the transformation problem before it was ever posed by talking about time as money. So those of you who are working on the transformation money problem now have your answer. I'm struck by the importance of war in banking and the creation of banking. But banking is also, as Julio said, very important for dealing with this question of timing. I will try to talk, maybe I can put this closer. Is that better?
Tilt it up to your face.
The mic is just for my camera, it's not going to help.
The mic is not for there is no sound system here. So we just have to talk loud.
Okay, I didn't know that. That's why I thought you were talking so loudly, because you had the microphone. Okay, let me stand up then and try to talk. And I'll try to talk louder. Am I okay now?
Much better.
The other concept of Marx is the concept of what he called the mortal leap. And I think it's a beautiful concept. And that is, between the time that the capitalist has to lay out money, there can be breaks in the circuit of circulation or in the circuits of production. And finance is necessary for that. So yeah, finance plays an important role in facilitating capitalist production. At the same time, finance also creates dangers for capitalist production. The old Hegelian unity of opposites. That we saw what happened in 2007 when the financial system took down much of the industrial system. Those two things go together. Now the question is, when does finance become such that it interferes with what Marx called capitalism's historic mission, which is to accumulate capital to provide the basis to go to a different kind of society. And there you run into a lot of difficulties with finance of what it does. In 1857, Marx was intensively interested in the speculation that caused a big collapse at the time. So he's very, very knowledgeable about the dysfunctionality of capitalism, of finance, and how it can be extractive and can operate to the detriment of accumulation. So it does both. And you cannot generalize one or the other. Let's talk about capitalism and war, because war is an essential part of capitalism too. And that is, I'm just finishing up a manuscript on early capitalism. And what struck me was all of these early capitalists in the mid-1600s, early 1700s, were totally concerned with war and the finance of war. And later you'll find that the Bank of England was established merely to create funding for the previous wars. So these early economists were very, very tied up with war. You go back in banking, and you find that there are two sources. One is war, and one is this question of moral leap. War, the first banks are, of course, the banks of the Knights Templar, which are holding money for pilgrims and for knights that are off there in the Middle East. And then as trade moves toward Italy, Italy starts creating profit-making banks. Italy starts creating profit-making banks. And then banks move up toward Holland, as Holland becomes the center of trade. And then finally to England, becomes the financial center of the world. These economists are looking at the banks and trying to get schemes to raise money for the wars that are necessary for trade, which are also necessary for capitalism. The leader of the Dutch East India Company, Jan Pieterszoon Koon, they once said, "There's no war without trade and no trade without war." The two are tied up together. And part of the financing that you get right now in the U.S., we have all this talk about deficit, but the deficit is, of course, back to war. Wars that we fight, wars that we plan, wars that, it's very hard to get. Now, when you get into finance takes on a life of its own. This is also a concept of Marx, that when he's talking about fictitious capital, he's talking about how fictitious capital can take a life of its own. And what we see now in the United States today is, at least on the eve of the Great Recession, I don't know why we call it a recession, on the eve of the Great Recession, 40% of all profits were going to the fire sector, finance, insurance, real estate. I think it's a beautiful name because of the disruptiveness of what they do. Some of it is productive, some of it is destructive. And when I was thinking about the talk, the name Michael Milken came to mind. Michael Milken is very interesting in that he represented to some people the creative side of finance. That is, companies like MCI were financed by what Michael Milken and his junk bonds. And Michael Milken was so good at accumulating finance, supposedly when he got the deal for MCI, he raised $1 billion in an hour. Not many of us could call our friends and in an hour raise $1 billion. MCI became very valuable, but then it becomes part of WorldCom, involved in another financial scandal, and it disappears. So at the same time, Michael Milken is one of the founders of the private equity business. He's considered to be responsible for the savings and loan crisis, and it's very interesting. At the time when Michael Milken was at his peak, he had an income of $500 million a year. To put that into context, before the escalation of financial salaries, that was equal to the $500 million that was the wealth of J.P. Morgan when he died. J.P. Morgan, seemed to own everything. He had $500 million. Of course, his $500 million, if we allowed for inflation, would be higher, but it's still the same. But the number $500 million still sticks in my mind because Milken held responsible, or one of the chief culprits in creating the Savings loan crisis, which cost the American taxpayer $500 million. So finance is parasitic. At the same time, it's productive, and we need to sort that out, and I think that's what you were trying to say. And the costs of finance come in all sorts of ways. One, finance has certain powers, and it allows them to get whatever political legislation they want, and this costs us in any number of ways. That is, it's a major factor in creating the inequality that is holding the economy back, disrupting capitalist financial historic mission. So then we go and we look at this finance and we see that it is creating enormous wealth, but without producing. There's a new book by Kostas Lapaptisis about profits without production, which is excellent if anyone's interested in markets and finance. It's a fantastic book. It's very long, very thick, and very interesting. I recommend it very highly. Is that enough there?
Repeat the title, please.
Profits without production. But at the same time, like Julio, he goes to great lengths to make the case that finance also serves productive purposes. So just as capitalists are exploitive, capitalism does produce certain benefits. I mean, here I have my tablet, but we still can do better. Where do we see, now Marx had another concept which brings us into finance, and that is secondary exploitation. It's something that Marxists don't talk about a lot, but secondary exploitation is the exploitation that comes in the circuits of capital. You're shaking your head?
No, I'm listening.
Okay, the exploitation comes in the circuits of capital. Things like payday loans, check cashing, very, very high profits, taking advantage of the most disadvantaged, and they're very profitable. And again, J.P. Morgan Chase and all the big banks engage in this to great profits, because what they do then is they get into another kind of secondary exploitation. What you do is you open the banks up to your checking account for your payday loan, and if you don't pay it, then the bank charges you a fee too, a late fee on your money, and it accumulates at a tremendous rate. So this is where the poor schnooks get their exploitation. Business gets exploitation of finance until Dodd-Frank. The banks were able to take enormous profits out of merchants, small and large, to the point that Walmart was crying that the swipe fees were so high. And the swipe fees are something that the banks have to put very little labor into. And then 1/1,000,000th of a penny worth of electricity, and they get their money. So finance is hitting us that way. Finance distorts the economy, and you go back to this private equity that Milken was starting, and you see that private equity now is doing everything they can to milk companies. What do? They'll buy your company, they'll use your pension fund as collateral to buy it, they'll borrow money, and they'll raise money from stockholders, and then the companies go bankrupt. The mattress industry is very interesting in this respect when we think about the productivity of capital. Simmons Mattress was turned over to 6 different private equity companies, and the Teachers' Pension of Ontario was left holding the bag on the last one. So here's a company, you take all of its assets, you load it up with debt, you sell it off to the stock market, you can charge fees. The New York Times just had an article about this. You can charge fees to the company even after it's sold. For several years, they'll still have to pay these high management fees. So the company goes bankrupt again. The next private equity company picks it up over and over and over. Fortunately, we had somebody who taught the public about private equity recently, our Republican candidate for president, Mitt Romney. But unfortunately, nobody did a good deal of work except a few union activists to talk about how destructive that operation was. But it really serves to promote the idea of deindustrialization. Another thing finance does is everybody knows that the stock market, stock prices go up when a company says they're going to lay off workers. And that's so profitable that companies are now making announcements of layoffs, even though their labor force is already bare bones and they're not going to lay anyone else off without shutting off the lights and closing the door. But you certainly see finance extracting a great deal out of labor where you have financial demands in terms of making the stock market high enough, protecting against unfriendly takeovers, so the companies then cut. The workers are the ones that get stuck. Their pension plans, their health care plans get, again, another form of I don't know if that be primary or secondary exploitation. They cut them both ways. So you have this system that's terribly unproductive. And what you see in the United States, if you look at manufacturing in the United States, it tends to go down. And where it does go up, it goes up largely on the basis of intellectual property laws, which are another form of exploitation and could be considered another form of So when you have manufacturing of some electronics, most of the costs of that are going to finance that's being held by other places. You also have another function of finance, and that is to help funds move offshore so nobody has to pay taxes. And then what that means is there will be pressure on Social Security, pressures on Medicare to cut them back, all for predatory finance. So our giant sucking, I almost wanted to use another one, our giant sucking vampire squid is very busy. And it has these tendons going out in all directions, sucking in every way. So while I agree with Julio that no, it's not just that finance is bad, capitalism is bad, but finance is also part of capitalism. And unless we can get some control of the financial system, we can't get control of the political system, and we cannot be able to create an industrial system that will create decent jobs for people. That is, I just had a class of students graduate, and I know the kind of jobs they're getting, and I know the kind of jobs they should be getting. And all that has to do with that giant sucking vampire squid. And yeah, it does some good. And we have to look at this in a form of balance. Now, so I hope I've made that case for balance. And I hope I've taught you the solution to the transformation problem. And I guess that's my 5 minutes. Good. So thank you.
The last speaker is Michael Hudson.
I think the name for this talk is a misnomer. To consider the vampire squid as a parasite. It's not a parasite. It's another animal. When parasitism in nature is usually part of a symbiosis. It's usually a small organism that invades the host. When a vampire squid attacks a prey, you know that there's no symbiosis there. It's coming from the outside, and you know what it does. It kills the prey. That's what dumb capitalists do. That's what Goldman Sachs does. It kills the prey. But that's not really how parasites work in nature. The parasites, first of all, need to keep the host alive, because if the host dies, then it can't provide any blood. What is it that the parasite really wants? It wants the host's surplus value. It wants the bloodstream. It wants the nourishment that the host takes in and feeds the parasite. The problem is, if you're a parasite, how do you get the host to feed you? Most hosts would not willingly take on a parasite. So every kind of a parasite in nature, from the Lyme disease mites to insects to amoebas, they all are very complex organisms within themselves. They have an enzyme that they infuse into the host that works right on the host's brain. And the first thing they do is they have a kind of Novocaine when they bite you, so that you don't feel the bite. It's as if it's not there. You don't sense it, and the parasite's there. And the first thing the parasite does is, once it gets to your brain, it tries to convince you that it's part of the host's own body. Not only part of the host, but the body favors the parasite. The body comes to think of the parasite as its child, to be protected. And the purpose of the host from the time the parasite comes in is to protect, the host wants to protect the parasite and help it nurture so it can get to the point where ultimately the host does die, because we all die in the end. But what's going to happen when we die? When the vampire squid kills its prey, it has to go on and find somebody new. But when the parasite dies, how does it go and find somebody new? Because it's only a little kid. It's only like a little insect or a little like amoeba. It has to convince the host to get devoured by some other animal so that the parasite gets in the other animal's organism and then passes through that. Usually it's a triangular life cycle. It's a very complex life cycle. So what we're dealing with is a kind of symbiosis in a large and a complex system. It's not simply attacking, looting, and emptying out, as Michael has described quite correctly, hedge funds doing, and as Goldman Sachs has described doing. So the intelligent parasite treats the host as almost helpful, and many parasites actually help the host find food. They want to do everything they can to sort of steer the host, sort of like the animals, the sucker fish that ride on sharks, and sort of steer them along. Well, the success of financial parasitism in our economy is to convince the economy that banking and finance are actually part of the host economy itself. And when the Wall Street Journal refers to Wall Street and the super rich, the 1%, as being job creators, the idea is to make the host economy think these are not job destroyers. They're not here to impose austerity, to make us look like Greece and Ireland and Iceland and empty us out. They're here to create our jobs. That's why Michael Milken was so widely applauded. And when Michael mentioned earlier that 40% of U.S. profits are in the fire sector, it's as if somehow we're all part of GDP, and somehow the finance, insurance, and real estate are all services. And they're services, they provide a service. If you provide a service, that's not taking from you, that's providing a service. Well, that's a parasite's view of the world. Of course, he's providing a service for the host. He's keeping the host alive so that ultimately he can, the host's job is to feed the parasite so its children can hatch, devour the host, and then move on and be devoured by yet larger hosts, which I guess is the equivalent of multinational investment. Coming from the dying economy into economies abroad that are lesser parasitized, such as Russia and the Ukraine. The key point, I think, that since we're here at the left forum to discuss is how is it that the host has become so disabled that it doesn't realize that it's been parasitized, that it thinks of finance as its child, to be nurtured as the leading sectors, and to the point that the allocator of resources in our economy is Wall Street, not the government, or not any entity that actually seeks to create profits in the classical sense of the term, which is the sense that Marx used. Profits to Marx were made by employing labor to produce goods and services to sell at a markup, surplus value. But that's not really what finance does to make money. It makes money off money, M to M prime, without the MC M prime intervening. And that's how almost all of the gains in the 1% have been made since 1980. It hasn't been largely by profits. In fact, it's been the more a financialized industrial company has to pay the financial sector, the less profit it has, because finance is a cost of business and interest is crowding out profits. Just like interest payments, mortgage interest, student loans, credit card debt is crowding out disposable personal income and shrinking markets. So what the US economy and the European economies are experiencing today is a shrinking of the economic surplus because it's all being absorbed by the financial sector that is not flowing it into the economy, like Say's law says, that production creates its own demand. Employers will pay their workers so that they have enough money to buy what the employers produce. But if the workers have to pay high mortgage payments for houses that are inflated on credit, if they have to set aside money in their pension funds to be turned over to Drexel Burnham to invest in crooked S&L loans, if they have to pay for their education, they're not going to be able to buy the goods and services they produce. So the circular flow of income within the economy is drained by the financial sector. Now, the whole idea of national income accounting originally was based on circular flow from William Petty, but most of all, Quenet, the physiocrat in France. Petty and Quenet were surgeons. They were doctors, and they used the idea of circular flow within the body to depict the economy as a human body with a bloodstream flowing. And when J.B. Say said, well, okay, this is the circulation of blood is like the circulation between producers and consumers in the economy, employers and their workers, he didn't take into account what the British classical economists were talking about, and that is the rentier rake-off. In 200 years ago, the main rentiers were landlords extracting rent. But today, on top of the landlord's back, you have finance. And most of the big real estate investors buy their properties on mortgage. They try to debt leverage. The idea of almost all real estate speculators is rent is for paying interest. And if you're a consumer, you're making an income to pay interest. You have to make enough income so that you can afford to pay off the student debt you've taken out, so you can afford to buy the house that you need to live, and so you can afford to pay the interest on the debt you've taken off. Now, 100 years ago, almost all the socialist parties of the world had the idea that money and credit should become part of the socialized capitalist economy as a public function. And the idea, and certainly what Marx expected, was that for industrial capitalism to transform the characteristic of finance so it would no longer be parasitic. Marx used the term parasite in relation to finance when he said that the financial parasite makes the economy save, but it makes it save to pay the financial sector. That literally has been what's happened in the American national income accounts since 2008. The amount of companies have stopped, banks have stopped lending. The amount of debt has gone on. In 2008, the saving rate for the U.S. economy was 0. And that's because there was plenty of saving by the 1%, but the saving by the 1% was all lent out to the 99% to become its debt. And so the 99% basically was working to pay the 1% who said, well, don't worry about debt, we owe it to ourselves. The ourselves were them, and the we were the 99% paying it to ourselves. And all of this is sort of buried under the fact of thinking of the financial sector as part of the body. Now, normally, a healthy body would develop antibodies to the parasite. It would be aware that the parasite's there, and it would design policies to deal with the parasites. And this is what the social democratic parties of Europe did 100 years ago. That's what the labor parties did. Now let's fast forward to last Sunday and the elections in Europe. All the papers said, look at what's happened. Look at all the big change. There's been an immense rise in the nationalistic parties, the right-wing parties, except for Syriza in Greece. And that was almost the entire headline. But actually, that wasn't the main lesson of the election last week in Europe. First of all, the big change was a sharp drop in turnout voting. Most of the population was not going to vote for the right-wing parties, and they certainly weren't going to vote for the ultra-right-wing, which are the socialist parties and the labor parties. How is it that the socialist parties of a year ago are now the leading advocates of austerity in Europe? The Socialist Party of Papandreou in Greece, the head of the Socialist International, imposed the austerity taxes in the program from Europe and fell from over 50% of the Greek vote in his time to 8% last Sunday. The entire world now realizes we have a parasite, and that parasite is a socialist party. And of course, it's not the kind of socialism you and I mean. It's the socialism of the vampire squid, the large financial banks. From Tony Blair's move to New Labour Party, serving the city of London, which is the banking sector, to Clinton, serving Wall Street. You have the Democratic Party, all of the parties that used to be on the left, who somehow, in their attempt to criticize industrial employers, they don't realize that the industrial employers, as well as the working class and labor, are both being parasitized by the financial sector. They somehow act as if the financial sector is sort of independent, or else it's part of the industrial sector. And I do not have any documentation on what I was told in the 1960s, both by Seymour Melman and by Terence McCarthy, that most of the travel fees and housing for the meetings at the Socialist International were all paid for by the CIA. It's not necessary to have the actual documentation. All you have to realize is that there's an immense amount of money coming out of the U.S. government and also by Wall Street and the Ford Foundation and the large foundations to support to somehow turn the socialist parties and the left away from what it was 100 years ago, from having an economic program to criticize the rentiers, to tax economic rent, to tax real estate, to put banking into the public domain, all of a sudden to make the focus non-economic topics, such as you see in the books downstairs. A lot of these are cultural, sexual. The one thing you're not going to find is a discussion of finance. So finance has successfully parasitized most of the left-wing political parties, as it's parasitized the industrial economy itself. You can see what's happened similarly in the Ukraine. What is a country such as the Ukraine supposed to do when at the last New York Review of Books, George Soros wrote his idea for the Ukraine. The kleptocrats should sell out to us Western investors as partners, and we'll help rationalize what they do to the Ukraine. By the way, there's a very good book on the Ukraine that was just published by press on, I have to put in a plug for that, a whole group of articles, Flashpoint in Ukraine. The idea is that Soros and the West wants to essentially convince the kleptocrats that the West will support what it takes, as long as they can then take their companies, issue them on the stock exchange. And remember, after the Russian neoliberals took over after 1991, Russia was the leading stock market in the whole world. The post-Soviet markets were the leading markets because they were not yet parasitized. So you can look at this whole process as Drexel Burnhamizing the post-Soviet economies. It's bewildering to me why most of the discussions, even of Marx on the left, are all Volume 1 Marxists. If you read Volume 3, that's all about what I've talked about. In Volume 3, Marx talks all about the exponential growth of debt, the tendency of debt to grow faster than the economy. That's why how Marx attributed financial crisis to. And I think that really should be the takeoff point for realizing that you need to recast the national income accounts. So instead of showing the fire sector as part of the economy, you look at it as overhead. It's not part of the economy. It's the parasite. It's the extractive part of the economy. Its income is not productive investment. It's extractive investment. And this contradiction between productive and extractive investment was the core of all classical economics. That was the aim of Marx in writing his theories of surplus value. It's all to collect what every economist had written about the distinction between productive and unproductive labor, unproductive and productive investment, right down the line. And the move against Marxism was basically a move against the whole thrust of the preceding 100 years, 200 years of classical economics that did this to somehow, in the 1890s, depict all of the economy as being a single homogeneous organism, as if there was no parasite. And that's what neoliberalism is. And that's what economics is taught today in the schools, that it's all part of a single organism. There's no such thing as unproductive income. All income is earned, and everybody earns in proportion to what they produce. This is what J.B. They give a prize for every year, the American Clark, J.B. Clark said. And it's significant that the American Economic Association's prize that liberals like Krugman won are called the J.B. Clark Memorial Prize because it's the prize for denying there is any such thing as parasitism. And if the left can elaborate that point, it will be able to get the votes that are now going to the right in Europe.
Okay, we have up to 50 minutes for questions and discussion, and between the alternatives of having one question to one person answer, and just going around the room, I think maybe collecting questions in groups of about 3 and then having the panelists respond might kind of capture the benefits of the other alternatives. So I'm going to try to move all the way around the room and get a representative sampling of the people here. So this gentleman here can begin.
I wonder if I can ask a question that brings things to a very local and immediate level for some of us, which is in municipal financing. And I speak as someone who's a non-economist and a non-attorney. And I'd like to ask whether when poor urban areas, poor cities, and I speak as someone on the city council, right up the road in Hartford, Connecticut, as you know, a very poor city, which is trying to dig itself out like other cities. One of the means of financing and trying to attract development is by giving tax assessment fixing agreements, always to attract developers by giving them tax breaks, usually at the expense of the ordinary folks in town who have to make up the taxes. I wonder if you can comment on that as a means whereby capitalists engender competition among states and cities for the sake of development. I mean, it's a common phenomenon. The other question I had to bank is that one noxious habit to make up a budget deficit is to sell city assets. Time and again, in particular, what we're dealing with now in this particular city is selling tax liens. And your comments may be about the sale of liens on property rather than a direct lien sale through neighborhood forces, local forces, when they sell tax liens to an out-of-town corporation, which then collects 18% and so on and so forth. True parasitism, in my view. So I guess I'm looking for some help from experts in how, in a city council, we can oppose that parasitism, and yet we need to balance the budget and so on and so forth. Can you comment on that? Tactics.
Yeah, let's get a few questions together. Let me stand up so that I can see the back. Okay.
My question is the current hypertrophy of the fire sector, or the finance sector, an aberration, or is this an expected normal cyclical phase in normally operating capitalism?
Yes. Okay. So, panelists?
Okay, I'll begin with the tax question. That's very important because it affects what are the reported profits. When Marx talked about profits, and anybody in the classical period talked about profits, what they really meant is cash flow, or what Wall Street accountants call EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, amortization, and depreciation. And that's because at the time they wrote, there wasn't an income tax, and you didn't have tax accountants expensing everything so that you don't have profit. You may remember what Leona Helmsley said, who was sort of the leading post-Marxist accounting economist. Rich people don't, or only the poor people pay taxes. Only the little people pay taxes. The objective of any accountant, if Standard Oil doesn't pay taxes, the real estate industry, if you look in the national income and product accounts under for the fire sector, the real estate, since World War II, you find not only does it not pay taxes, it actually gets a tax loss write-off for claiming that its buildings are losing money by over-depreciation, even while the buildings are soaring in price, according to the Federal Reserve flow of funds statistics. So the depiction of the economy in terms of profits makes it appear as if the rich people are somehow not making profits at all. They make capital gains. And they make capital gains basically by asset price inflation. The result of not paying taxes is, of course, that they create the urban crisis, which is the second part of that question, and the privatization, such as Chicago selling off its sidewalks to Goldman Sachs, the right to put parking meters on it, so that all of a sudden the price of downtown Chicago parking has gone way up. Of course, there's a good solution to cities having to privatize their property and sell off these toll booth rights for rentiers to put up toll booths. It's called the real estate tax. I mean, that was what was, there was no reason at all for Chicago or for New York not to tax the increased value of the real estate that's being inflated by debt. And they've been able to talk about parasitism taking over the brain. The banks have been able to trick the public into believing that if they raise the taxes on real estate, people will have to pay more. Actually, the reality is if you do not tax real estate, all this increased rental value from the public services that are provided, from the prosperity, and from the credit, all this rental value will be pledged to the banks for debt. So whatever the tax collector relinquishes ends up being paid to J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and the financial sector. So the solution, not only to avoid privatization, but to keeping down housing costs, to keeping down the financial overhead, is a tax system. The tax system and policy should be the way, the anti-parasitic enzyme in the bloodstream to prevent what I've been talking about. The other question was whether this is a cycle. No, what we're going through now is not a cycle. It's the end, it's a phase change. It's the end of a process that has been occurring since the end of World War II. Every recovery since World War II has started from a higher and higher and higher debt level. So that now the debt level is so high that it's like trying to drive a car with the brake pressed right down against the floor. The brake is pressed so far down that there's no way of being able to expand the economy while you have to pay the overhang of mortgage debt, credit card debt, and student loans that is all blocking recovery. So what we are is in a debt deflation. And you could say that the debt deflation is the final cycle of asset price inflation. And that, by the way, is what my book, The Bubble and Beyond, is all about. But it's certainly not a cycle. The pretense is that it's all a cycle and we can get back to normal. What was normal was the ability of the parasite to take all of the growth of income for itself. And but now that there's no more income to take, you can't return to that normal because you're already taking everything you can. Time to kill the host and move on to a new one.
A couple of things. I'm not sure I agree on one point with Michael about whether it's cyclical or not, because there have been cycles in which debt gets wiped out. And that is something Marx talks about, is reinvigorating the economy. However, what's happened recently is rather than allow that elimination of debt to occur, as it normally does, we cut off the cycle with the bailout. So historically, it was cyclical, but I think we're in a period now where we've made it a permanent process. Now, with regard to taxes moving around, everybody knows where Mickey Mouse is, right?
Say that louder.
Ireland.
Yeah.
Ireland. That's where Google, that's where Microsoft keep their intellectual property so they don't have to pay taxes. Now, companies that do have a physical presence, because the Google and Microsoft and Disney businesses are subsidiaries and they keep taxes differently. But with businesses, it's very common that a business says, I will move out unless, and then they extract their pound of flesh. In the case of companies, it usually runs about $100,000, $200,000 per job, per promised job, not per job, when companies agree to move into a new place. As companies don't come to some city and say, I'm going to build a factory here because I like the city. It's, I'll build a factory here. What will you give me? I'll create 2,000 jobs. And in many cases, the jobs never occur, but the tax benefits are there. When Walmart wants to build a store, it comes to the city and says, what we need, though, is a widened street, we need extra sewage, we need all of these city services, but we're not going to pay for them because we're such a good company, you should be glad to have us. So what you see now is the share of taxes paid by corporations going way down. The share of taxes paid by individuals. Again, our economics professor, Mitt Romney, talked about that. The reason he apparently had only 2 years of taxes given was the third year was the year that they gave a get out of jail free card for people who took their money back into this country. And that would have hammered his chances of getting elected. So this question of tax, in companies like General Electric, their tax office is considered a profit center. It's not just a way of reducing taxes, it's a way of finding ways to get profits, as Michael was saying. And when what happens is we're told we have to shut down the post office, we have to shut down Medicare, we have to shut down Social Security. Otherwise, we cannot feed the monster.
Oh,
Just very
Didn't answer my question.
and I'm not sure I will be able to do that either. But what I wanted to say is that maybe there wasn't enough truth in advertising. We call it the vampire squid something something, even though, and then also there is the term parasitic in the title of the panel, right? And apparently we are finding flaws in the metaphor or in the analogy. Yeah, I definitely find that analogy faulty. I guess that was kind of the point of my remarks, that I don't view finance as a parasite or as a vampire squid, you know, superimposed on a body. I see finance as a limb or as an organ. It's a vital organ of the body of capitalism. So if you want to call the entire body the parasite, well, call it so, because indeed, you know, capital grows at the expense of nature, at the expense of human life at the end of the day. So, and that is the first volume of Capital, which I believe supplies the essence of Marx's understanding of the entire you know, phenomena of capitalism in all its complexity and all that. Volume 3 is really important, so just piggybacking on Michael's remarks. Volume 3 is really important. However, a lot of the focus on Volume 3 is on competition, is on the formation of profit, the formation of the different forms of property income, right? How, you know, how that surplus value, that additional amount of time that workers produce, but not for themselves, but for someone else, for the capitalists, how that booty is distributed, how it is allocated, how there is this fight over that booty, and that of course is essential, you know, in understanding the you know, the manifestations of capitalism and how capitalism affects our lives directly and concretely. However, I think that the ultimate message is take a step back and see ultimately what is at stake here. And what is at stake, again, I should remark it, is, you know, the essence of our humanity. You know, the essence of our humanity, that's what it is this fragmentation of us, where part of our time, part of our mindful time, is not for us. It's for a power that is just grown and out of control and dominates us and makes our lives into a nightmare. And it's about appropriating, you know, our entire focus time, our entire labor time, and not just the part that the capitalists decide to provide us with, you know, to give us in the form of wages, salary, labor, income. So that's that. And one point of one of the questions on whether the phenomenon is cyclical or not. I think that it has a lot of cyclical components. In fact, I will say just this much. In addition, if you look at the data, right? If you look at the data of the expansion of finance, right, or the financial sector in the national accounts, you will notice that this is not peculiar to finance alone. Non-financial services actually have experienced a more spectacular growth from the 1945 to the present. Healthcare, educational services, and all that. So ultimately, what we're talking about here, right, and all of them, just like finance, they provide certain things that are essential for human life, regardless of whether we organize our society along capitalist lines or not. There are certain things that are essential to our lives. Like, for example, you know, we need to protect ourselves against hurricanes, right? It just turns out that in our society, that's an insurance industry that is in charge of doing that thing, right? So we have insurance contracts, insurance policies, etc., that are going to be traded in the financial markets, etc. Right? But ultimately, what we have is us. Right? So ultimately, we're going to rebuild an area that has been devastated by a hurricane. Is about mobilizing us to do that job. Right? And how we do it from a legal financial viewpoint is secondary, it's subsidiary. So in response to your question, I will say I'm not an expert on those issues of municipal bonds and municipal finance and all that, on how to balance budgets and all that. And I understand the pitting municipalities against municipalities and all that to extract blood from us. I will say, ultimately, we don't have to become financial experts or legal experts to deal with these things. We just have to assert what our human needs. We assert our human needs, right? Our basic human needs, and we organize and we fight, right? And then, we'll figure those things out as we go, right?
Yeah. All right. Hold on, I'm just looking for all sorts of variety. Yes, first. Go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, so there's a couple companies that are doing revolutionary things right now. Walmart, Amazon, Google. Amazon and Walmart, I'll put together, they're working right now logistically to optimize their profits in the form of getting rid of workers and using mechanical automation. Google right now, earlier in the week, they unveiled their self-driving car technology. So, get rid of taxi drivers, things like that. They also acquired a vast amount of robotics companies, and they're very, very close to getting rid of all fast food jobs. What else? Go to a movie theater, ticketers. Pretty much what I'm saying is in the very, very near future, there's really going to be no jobs. So, people are talking about raising the minimum wage, this, that, and the other thing. And that's fine, but that's fine if you have a job. What's the world going to look like in 5, 10, 12, 15 years when these companies that we've seen are incredibly good at maximizing profits by kind of taking advantage of their workers? What are we going to see when that's really kind of like on steroids?
No. Go ahead.
Recently there was a book out called Rethinking Money by Bernard Leclerc, in which he recounts a conversation he had with Paul Krugman about 10 years ago. And in it he says, in effect, Krugman told him, he said, the one thing that I listened to from my MIT professors, they told me, and I was very, very conscious to follow up on their advice. He said, they told me, never touch the money issue. And if you read Krugman's columns recently and his debates with Steve Keen, it's clear that he did not touch the money issue, he does not understand the money issue. And I think that the economics profession as a whole has been, as Michael described with parasitism, I think they've been bitten and their brains have been anesthetized to the money issue. They're not capable, it seems, for the most part, to deal as economists with the money issue. The money issue, as the lady in the back whose question was not dealt with, is a very simple issue. Banks, private banks, create 97% of all money that comes into existence. It is only created when loans are taken out, so 97% of all money is debt. There's no, you don't have to be a brain surgeon to figure out why debt is overwhelming everyone, from individuals to nations. And there's no way out of it as long as money is created by private banks as debt. The solution, again, you don't have to be a brain surgeon. Take the power away from the private banks to create the money and return it to the people. I cannot understand and fathom why such intelligent people in the economics profession cannot see something that an ordinary person I could explain to in about 5 minutes and they get it. And I would hope my question or statement would at least be addressed.
Thank you. Okay, that's for the panel. One more. Looking for burpee rule.
Thank you.
Okay.
I'm concise. The effects of U.S. government deficits versus those of surplus on this phenomenon of financialization. Theory A being that when there's a surplus, the absence of net financial assets forces people to borrow. Theory B saying that when there are deficits, all the new bonds and all the new reserves spur this financialization and enable banks to leverage. Or theory C is whatever you folks about.
Anywhere? Yes.
Okay. I'll begin with the latter question first. I remember how Bernard Lutyrer told me that he went to school with Krugman. Obviously, Krugman's intelligent. Ron, you have to be very intelligent in order to be able to imagine an economy that works without any money or debt having anything to do with it. You have to be almost a genius to imagine how this whole system can work without debt, without money. What Krugman meant when he said, leave money analysis to the technocrats. And we all know who the technocrats are. The technocrats are who were put in charge of Greece after Papandreou was kicked out, ruling on behalf. The technocrats are the former officers of Goldman Sachs who are now running Italy, Greece, and the other Eurozone countries that can't pay their debts. So essentially, the idea, when I had to go to school 50 years ago at NYU, everybody was talking about Milton Friedman and the monetary theory that MV equals PT, that somehow money is like, the money supply is like air in a balloon. And here's the economy with a pattern of how it works imprinted on it, the balloon, and you're inflating it or you're deflating it, and it keeps the same shape, but it goes up or it goes down. It's very interesting that Friedman, who had this ridiculous theory that you really have to be very clever to have such a successful deception, such a successful error, that a generation of students is taught this nonsense. Friedman knew it was a lie. He dedicated his book on monetary theory to Simon Newcomb, who was a great American astronomer who wrote a book on the Civil War financing of the greenbacks and debt. And Newcomb made it very clear that when he talked about the money supply going up, we all know what credit is given for. The credit and the money that is created is not to employ labor. It's not to buy goods and services. It's not to increase the price of commodities. It's to inflate asset prices. 80% of bank loans are mortgage loans. The effect is to increase the price of property and oblige new home buyers to go even deeper into debt to buy their homes. So, but if you're not allowed, if you have to now talk about an economy that only produces and consumes, there's no wealth. If you don't have, not only is there no money, you have to create a picture of an economy, a parallel universe in which there's no wealth, no money, no claims, and nobody owes anybody anything else. This is the image that Krugman does. That's why he's so applauded by the neoliberals. This man is the left. If he's the left, you need have no fear of any kind of a retort. So that's exactly what we're dealing with, that when people want to see the left view, they read Krugman. And Ron referred to the debate that Krugman had with Steve Keen. Usually Krugman just sort of denounces us all as a whole. He hardly ever mentions any of us from Kansas City, but because Steve is an Australian, he thought that maybe nobody would notice if he takes this poor Australian to criticize. Steve's PhD is in mathematics. A debate ensued where he absolutely was Bambi meets Goliath. If you all, any of you want to Google Steve Keen Krugman, you'll have a ball. We were all in Berlin a few years ago an INET conference where Steve, just the week after all of this to-do came out, and it was absolutely wonderful. I want to say something about what Julio said. He said that we all need education. That's essential. That healthcare is essential. But is it essential that we pay so much for education? Is it essential that education be privatized? Is it essential that healthcare be privatized? You can't justify the parasite by saying it's essential to let it make you pay more for what is essential. The parasite puts a toll booth in and says in order for the host economy to be fed, it has to go through us, and makes itself appear to be essential. There's no need for NYU to charge the highest student debt in the country. That was not the original idea of the land-grant colleges. These prices that people pay, the interest to the financial sector, the economic rent, all these are what the classical economists call economic rent. And not only is money and credit and debt excluded from the view of the economy, but economic rent, the concept of unearned income, is excluded. The other question was about technology. And there are two answers to that. Marx dealt with Ricardo's discussion that, well, look at all machinery, the power weaving is putting labor out of work. Marx pointed out that there can be no permanent technological crisis under capitalism. That is the essence of volumes 2 and 3 of his Theories of Surplus Value. It was for this reason that the Communist Party broke into the printing company and destroyed the plates where the first English translation of Marx is to be printed, because the communists realized that to translate Marx means the end of Stalinist economics, the end of the Stalinist, and very soon Dobb in England came out with the international publishers' version of Theories of Surplus Value that was a travesty. So first of all, Marx said the capital goods making industries are going to be the major employers for what is unemployed. But then 100 years ago, every socialist and labor party in the world was talking about this technology problem. They all had the same response. Yet the result is going to be we can all live like Frenchmen live today with 35-hour weeks and public health. We'll have a life of leisure. Everybody, Simon Patton, all the others were talking about the leisure economy. If you have technology, there's no need for people to be employed at what was then a 60-hour week or now a 40-hour week. There's a simple solution to all of this, a change in the work schedule. That's what socialism was supposed to be all about. And the blaming our problems on technology or the fact that the old people are savers is simply could not succeed without the financial parasite deadening the brain of the host economy to resist this.
I would like to talk about your question about work, and I partially agree with Michael, largely agree with Michael. Keynes had a wonderful essay called Economic Prospects for Our Grandchildren. And he says, yeah, you take care of that by shortening the working day, which is what Michael's talking about. But on the other hand, there's a difference between jobs and work. There's lots of work to be done, whether it's in education, healthcare, environmental remediation. The problem is that capitalists do not hire people for that kind of jobs because it's difficult as a profit-making exercise. That is, it's hard to see how you could start a company that would work on environmental remediation unless you own the property that's being fixed up. So there's work to be done, and what we have to do is develop a political system so that we can use our work to get done what's needed to be done instead of to hire our mathematicians and physicists to do better algorithms for beating the stock market. Yeah, there's a lot of work to do, and it's a very important question. What's interesting now is that very conventional economists are coming to this point and saying technology is going to be undoing us. There's a MIT economist with an unpronounceable Icelandic name. It should be illegal by slanted names. But anyway, he used the example of Instagram, which started with 12 employees, and Eastman Kodak, which had several hundred thousand. And you have Instagram and applications like that doing the same work that Eastman Kodak was doing. And there's so many jobs that can be digitized that can destroy the job market as it's presently constituted. That's the problem, as it's presently constituted.
I guess there's so much to talk about, but I'll just try to keep it briefly. On technology, it's a testament to the power of the system how we tend to view technology as a juggernaut, some sort of, out of control thing that has its own life. Actually, technology is what we people do. We produce and reproduce what we call technology, scientific knowledge with engineering applications, etc. It's what we do or what we don't do that creates that phenomenon that we call technology that seems to be enveloping our lives and pushing us in certain directions even against our own will. And so it's something that, it's obviously mastering technology, turning technology into a servant of our needs, it's precisely what socialism is about. The struggle for socialism is the struggle to appropriate our powers that have been hijacked from us. Right? So that's the main message that I take from Marx, and I keep repeating it. So when Walmart is doing this, I think, amazing things, in terms of, coordination, organization, deployment of, resources across the globe, right? I mean, like putting together, pieces that are all scattered around the world, right? And connecting them and making them flow. That, that reminds me of the socialist calculation debate, in the early mid 20th century. There was this debate. Friedrich von Hayek was one of the proponents of the idea that socialism was unworkable. It's impossible to do so many calculations at once, right? Even if we had like powerful computers, we wouldn't be able to coordinate and to match the resources that we have and the needs that we have in order to meet those needs with those resources. That's such a complex thing that it will completely overwhelm us. And so as a result, we have to rely on markets. That means we have to just act like little ants and, and just take information around us and then take actions that may or may not gel globally, right? So as a result, we may destroy the planet, but at least we are free and we are independent and blah, 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 Well, it turns out that, that somebody like the Waltons, which by the way are not in, well, what they do has to do with finance, but, but their main business is wholesale and retail trade, right? So they are, among the top richest people in the world. Actually, if you look at the Forbes billionaires list, you will see that finance people are not the top ones. It's Bill Gates, it's telecommunications guy Carlos Slim in Mexico, those kind of people. And then you have Bloomberg and all that, but they are like down here. And Bloomberg, by the way, is more like information rather than finance. But back to the story about the calculation debate, right? So I think that somebody like Walton would say, you think that matching resources and needs at this complex global scale is impossible? Just wait and watch. I'll do it. I'll show you how that can be done. So one part of me thinks, when Google is doing all these things, I'm hoping, right? Because of course it depends on whether we take action or not. But my hopeful, my aspiration here is, okay, let Google do that. We will take them over. We will appropriate them. We will expropriate them. And we will make Google, maybe we will rebrand it or rename it, right? But we will make it serve our needs rather than be a profit-making machine for the few. Money. I can see the point of Paul Krugman avoiding the topic. I teach money and banking, at undergrad students, and the way I try to explain this to my students, right? Because instead of quoting Marx and all that, You know, it's like this. You know, in principle, you know, when we people create society, when we form society, we help each other. Right? That's what we do. It's called cooperation, right? Marx calls that labor cooperation. But it basically means I help you, you help me. Helping and being helped, that's all we humans are good for. Well, that and the opposite, right? Which is conflict and, you know, dissolving our social fabric, right? But so if we are forming society, we're making society, we have to help one another. And so it just turns out that in our society, the way we help one another is because we are private owners, so I will help you, but I will also be helped in according to certain proportions that we call prices. So I scratch your back, you scratch my back, but the proportion at which this back scratching takes place is regulated by the whims of the market, which means all of us together buying and selling back scratching, right? So when we are trading, what we are doing is we are exchanging bonds, right? That means claims of ownership over stuff, over things, right? And these are securities, right? It goes from a simple receipt that demonstrates that you are the owner of that bottle of water, and therefore you are legally entitled to disposing of it within certain confines that are set by society and by, of course, the laws of nature. But so money is just a particular type of bond. Money is just a particular type of legal claim over wealth that we traffic, that we trade in the markets. And so, in principle, you know, nothing prevents me from issuing bonds, right? The problem is, will I be able to sell them? In other words, will I be able to borrow from you? Well, I don't know, because you don't know me, right? But, you know, even like Barnes & Noble issues these cards, you know, gift cards, and a lot of people pay for them and then they forget about them and they are never redeemed, right? So that's actually Senior Ash, right? That Barnes & Noble is pocketing, right? So then the issue is what makes certain bonds acceptable. And so the moneyness of money has to do with the acceptability of bonds, right? And I will leave it at that.
I think we have time for another round, and I'll recognize this woman here, please.
You, the gentleman in the middle, you mentioned taking action against, nothing will happen if we take action. What action can we take, or what do you suggest? What is action against?
It depends on where we are, right? We all have needs that are not being met by the system, by our society, by, you know, this collective aggregation of individuals, right? And the interactions that we do with one another. You know, our government, our local government, our federal government, there are a bunch of needs that are not being met, right? So we are not happy with our lives, and in part is because, you know, the rest of society is not cooperating with us, right? So what we need to do is in the first place, recognize those needs. In the second place, recognize that there are many people, the majority, the 99%, who share those or similar needs. And we have to join forces with them. And then try to make all this social structure that we create, that we call governments, markets, whatever, the economy, right? All of this technology, all of these things, try to make them serve those needs. And that requires struggles that are, as they used to call them, economic in nature. I mean, like workers demanding that their working conditions are better, that their wages are better, that are higher, and so for that they need to organize unions, etc. Right? Or, you know, we are sick and the insurance, or we don't have insurance, and so we demand healthcare publicly provided, etc. Right? The needs are specific to individuals, but then when we start to struggle for you know, meeting those needs, we realize that there are many other people who share them or very similar needs. And then there is the issue of how do we coordinate, you know, these struggles and all that. And so that's what I'm talking about. So I cannot like specifically refer to, you know, your case, because I don't know where you are located, what are your particular issues, but I'm pretty sure that we have a 20-minute conversation, we will find points of coincidence.
Let's get a round of questions. And I'm looking for hands. Okay, in back, the gentleman. Yes.
The EU recently passed financial transaction tax, and since we're kind of talking about the great vampire squid, some people kind of raise it as a measure that would effectively stop high-frequency trading. It's usually based on really marginal profits, 0.2, 0.5% profits, and a financial transaction tax might kind of take away the incentive to do that. Do you see the financial transaction tax as kind of like a half measure that doesn't actually transform the fundamental nature of finance and the way that it parasitizes the economic system? Or do you think that it actually has real potential, if passed in America, to change the nature and the way capital acts in finance?
Let's take a couple more, and then I think that'll probably do it. Yes.
I haven't had a chance to get through Piketty's book. It's fairly large. He traces a couple hundred years of global inequality, capitalism, problem of inflation of assets and whatnot. I'm wondering if you have any insight or to tie that to our current context of those implications of parasitic conflict.
Okay, one more.
Does anybody have any faith that we actually might have some allies in the financial community who may want to do a little Trojan horse action from the inside, or is that all lost, or are they beyond redemption?
Okay, I think I'm going to leave it for the panel for some final comments, and then we can talk informally. Who would like to?
I didn't hear some of the questions. Okay, go ahead. I didn't hear some of the questions.
Well,
I did hear the financial transactions tax.
Take that one.
The financial transactions tax makes a lot of sense. It's an easy thing. It doesn't really hurt anybody in need, and it could raise quite a bit of money, and it might make the type of efforts going into making these minute profits off of transactions that could take a millisecond. I think it could have some good effects. I don't know of any negative effects of the financial transaction tax. She asked about what we can do. I mean, I don't know how many people come to the left one. Most of us have fairly similar ideas. Why the hell can't we somehow work something out? Whereas so much on the left ends up becoming factionalized. I remember when I was in college during the 60s, everybody wanted to be this leading radical group, and everybody else was supposed to follow, and nobody wanted to listen. Listening is very important. Communicating is very important, like Julio says. And then we get a hell of a lot done. And there are organizations, there are movements that have been tremendously successful. You mentioned Walmart before. During the populist movement, there were farmers that were organizing these very complicated networks of production and distribution outside of capitalism. So, yeah, there's a lot we can be doing, and it's, I don't know, maybe the toxic stuff from the predator reached our brains.
Well, on Piketty, wait for my editorial perspectives. There's going to be like an editorial note on Science and Society at some point. So I'm plugging that.
I'm turning my platform over to Julio for one issue.
Okay, I'll make a comment on Piketty on the proposals that he makes, right? About the global tax on wealth, anything that taxes wealth or taxes the income from wealth, income from capital, right? Profits under any form. I'm for. Yes, tax them and then use those resources, for the 99%. Absolutely, I'm all for that. Now the problem of course is the implementation of that, right? And so he is looking at this from a kind of an abstract general point of view, but you know, it's not a technocratic issue. It's not something that you can decide technocratically. It's something that has to be fought for. And then in the fight for that, and that is kind of a similar criticism that I have for the post-Keynesians. You know, I agree on part of their political platform. You know, we want spending, we want, you know, effective demand to shift, etc. All that I'm for. The problem is how you accomplish that, and then by accomplishing that, then actually it turns out that in order for the capitalists to accept such a drastic change in legislation, right? Number one, the coordination, right? To make it stick as a global tax, right? That's a nightmare, right? Politically speaking, that's a nightmare. Okay, accomplishing that for the richest countries in the world, that's a little bit more doable, but it's still a very high call. But so in developing the strength to accomplish something like that is where I see the merit of this demands, of these slogans, you know. Tax the wealthy, absolutely. But, you know, because ultimately, if a tax like that, if a fiscal change of that magnitude is going to be implemented, it's going to require a tremendous amount of fighting, right? Tremendous amount of fighting. And so, and if people develop that kind of, if they are capable of asserting themselves, right, and noticing that they can actually reshape legislation and impose a tax on the rich, then probably people are going to want more than that, right? So I guess the best, actually the best, and this is another commercial for David Laitman, the best explanation I've read about, you know, how to look at reforms and the movement for a radical change, you know, for the overthrowing capitalism and replacing it with something better is an editorial perspective that he wrote like a couple of years ago, right? If you Google editorial perspectives, David Laitman, Reforms Revolution, something like that, you will get it. It's in a PDF, it's for free online.
Well, if we're doing commercials, it will be in my forthcoming book, which is called Passion and Patient, Essays on Social Change.
There you go. And just one little thing about the Trojan horse. Bankers are just like us, but doing banking, and some of them are rich, right? But they are human beings. So is it possible that some of them may be, I think this tiny minority that may be motivated to work for us. And if they are there and they are doing that kind of work, I'm for it, absolutely. Yes.
Okay, I think we'll wrap up with a couple more commercials. First of all, Science and Society, which are one of the journals that Julia and I participate in editing in, which co-sponsored this session. And there's a lot about finance and many similar topics covered there all the time. Please check it out on the web. Please look for us downstairs in the literature area and think about subscribing. Print journals, which have an online presence also, are still important. Science and Society.
Okay.
Science and Society. And finally, the Union for Radical Political Economics. If you are a radical political economist or someone interested in radical political economics without any particular affiliation, it's a 45, 50-year-old
from 1968
organization. We're approaching our semi-centennial or whatever that is. And it's going strong, and it's very important, and it's very respected in economics and in political activism, and you should check URPE, U-R-P-E, Union for Radical Political Economics out also. Get some literature and maybe think of joining. And with that, I'll call this one to an end. Keep discussing.